by supplemental.
So some basic concepts. I mean, does those, you guys get those three basics? Make a lot of sense? I'm hoping so.
And you know, this is not, you know, amazingly new, right? If you mess with Selenium or any kind of web automation, it's like, oh, duh, this is what it does, right? But no one's really sat down and formalized this stuff and tried to create these flows, and we'll show you why this is really interesting later.
So the basic concept behind the application data map is really looking at, you know, why do we need this? An application data map defines the flows with the context of data. One of the things that I've always struggled with, you know, as pen test applications is the idea that, you know, I need to get all the way through this app, and if I push a crawler to it, odds are it's going to miss it. Now, even the best case automation, think about it this way, best case automation. Say you've got a page, it's got a radio button and a drop down. Okay? Radio button has two different options, and the drop down has 50 possible select options. One of those causes the application to give you page A. The other rest, every other combination, causes it to give you page B. Branch out that way, right? What are the odds of an automation tool getting both of those? Pretty low, right? I mean, you sacrifice coverage and completeness for speed. Nobody likes web scanners that run 3-4 weeks at a time.
Trust me, you can configure the scanners to do that sort of stuff, right? You can turn off all the limits that it has by default, and it'll just run forever doing this sort of stuff. But you know, what Rafal's talking about there is basically, you know, if you have when you're selecting American Express or, you know, Visa, the server is going to do different things based on that input, right? So if one's vulnerable, you have to make sure you cover all of that. And if you're the QA guy, you know that, right? You have the implicit knowledge that, oh, American Express and Visa are different, but the scanners are just like, oh, one of these, I don't know. So
the idea is we want to define data where necessary, and if it's not defined, right, it can be assumed to be completely arbitrary. You can dump wherever you want it. So let me illustrate. I'm a visual kind of guy, so I'm going to illustrate this in pictures for you, right? 3 steps: map the application, add data, and execute the action. So if you want to go get something out of a safe, the traditional security testing approach is to bring a 25-pound sledge and beat on it till the safe opens. Right? Am I wrong? Crickets? So the data that we're mapping, the ADM that we're mapping here, is the combination. I want to be able to open the safe in some reasonable amount of time. Right? I want to get to see what's inside the safe. Maybe I need to have something inside the safe. Right? Maybe there's a next step in there somewhere. Maybe the message will self-destruct, and if I don't get to it in time, right, things go away. So the idea here is, if you think about an application where you've got a registration page, this is a classic example that I've always kind of come back to. You've got a landing page and you have this fork, and you can either go to login or registration. If you go to login, all right, fine, you type in your credentials and you move along happily. However, if you go to a registration page, you need data. How many typically good applications require you to have a predefined user on the site before you can actually log in? Like higher security systems, right? You have to be defined on the system before you can register. If you don't have that data, you can be banging against that login form for hours.
Well, and not only that, right? If you register once, right, you make that registration request. You register the username, and that username has to change, otherwise you're not going to actually test the security of that page.
That is very true.
So now we've got pretty pictures, right? So how does all this kind of work, right? So we've taken some example. This is the kind of the mock-up of what Gmail would look like when I'm sending an email. And so, you know, what happens at the functional level? What's the user actually doing? Well, I log in, which is, you know, a set of, I'm going to go over here. So there's a, you know, when I log in, you know, it actually causes like 3 different requests, right? So I log in, you know, I put my username and password in, and then now I'm on the login page, it's loading all sorts of extra data, the site analytics, whatever that is. When I compose my email, you know, I'm actually typing stuff in, and it's getting all the addresses and stuff. So we're making AJAX queries, we're doing some other stuff, we're actually, you know, checking the spell check and stuff like that. And then when I hit send, you know, there's some magic that kind of happens, some more AJAX, and then all of a sudden you're back to the original page.
By the way, who's ready to go map this out by hand?
Yeah, right? Yeah, I mean, this is, so, you know, how does this actually map into HTTP, right? So this is kind of what was going on, right? So I've obviously changed the URLs here just because I needed to put it into this table. But, you know, I needed to get the original page, then I performed some kind of action, which was actually the login action, right? Then I needed to compose something, and then, you know, record some JavaScript events, And this is how we turn this graph kind of into a set of things that an automation tool can look at and say, this is what I need to do to perform these different actions. So where does the ADM fit in, right? So basically you got to figure out where the data is, right? So we can look at things like for and post variables and stuff like that, but data is a little bit more than that, right? If you have a, Ajax, which is actually like a GUID application or something that uses not really complex, but complicated queries that aren't just using a HTTP variable, actually using things that are composed of, maybe it's base 64 or like 19 variables or something like that. For example, the username and password could be that base 64 blob. So just because there's only one variable here doesn't mean there's multiple. There isn't multiple on the client side.
So I'm gonna, before we continue too far into it, because I'm gonna start getting into some uses for this in a second here. But are you guys? Have I convinced anybody this is a good idea? We're not trying to come up and tell you that all automation sucks, okay? Because it's got its uses, and today it's actually still pretty useful. What we're trying to say, and what I think we're demonstrating here, is as things get complex, we got higher order complexity, right? I think there's no doubt in the world here that a human being can't continue to test this stuff by hand. Source code can't be manually looked at anymore. You've got millions of lines of code. There's reasons for that, right? You just can't handle it. You don't have enough whiteboard space on your wall. You can't test this stuff, even with the best sets of automation that we have today, because applications are so complex, there's logic in them that is so complex that it has to be tested. And the number one question that drove me to kind of start thinking about this is when you go and you run a web scanner today, and you go to management and say, here's the report, I'm done, it's got this many vulns in it. They go, well, how much of the app did you test? And you go, good question. Well, the crawler says I did this much. Well, what is that much?
I crawled 50 pages. Okay.
Well, the application, so even better, right? What about those really cool J2EE apps that have like an MVC model and you've got one page? How much of the application surface have you tested? You just don't know. And as it gets more complex, I mean, let's talk about Flash and Silverlight for just a second, without beating them up too bad. That's an entirely different application attack surface that's completely on the client side. There's but there's very little client-server interaction here. A lot of the stuff happens in your browser.
Not only that, like even if you decompile these things, and this is stuff that we've done, right? So we decompile Flash, we decompile a Silverlight object, and we can pull out the strings for the web service URLs and stuff. But just because we can pull that out, we're not necessarily able to correctly request those pages, right? I mean, if they're flagrantly vulnerable, that's one thing. But if it's using some kind of complex web service, WS star or something like that, where you have to actually run the application to make the requests, it's a whole other ballgame.
All right, so let's talk about some real kind of uses for this and why it's important and why we're trying to convince everybody to start thinking this way.
Yeah, so, what we talked about was basically what, a pen tester was doing, right? We just kind of formalized the pen tester going through an application and doing stuff. But when you have this kind of formalized view of it, you have this graph, right? You can start to do some really interesting stuff. Like, if I know that this is the area where the credit cards are, and then I start running an automated tool, I can say that, oh, these two vulnerabilities are much more important than this one is, right? Because this is in the credit card area. I've marked up this graph.
Hold the phone. So that means that all critical vulnerabilities aren't critical? There's not one idea, right? How
many times have you guys sat down and looked at a vulnerability and be like, well, I need to rate that one down, or I don't really care.
Let me ask that question. Do you guys do that? Do you do that? Do you look at, for example, like the 50 SQL injection vulnerabilities that your scanner or tools or whoever it is generate and go, okay, these are SQL injected. They all must be critical. Do you guys actually go back and re-review those to see whether they are critical?
Yeah.
Initiatives to kind of weight this thing.
Right. There's an entire area of thought that says when is critical not. Right? The SQL injection vulnerability on your login page is much different in weight and requirements and importance than the one that's behind a certificate auth-based admin console that two people have access to. Right? It's way different. But on most, because they're tools and they can't think, they're still critical. So this kind of thinking